name is Anu and I'm going to present to you a small introduction to the MVC architecture. Not only am I going to talk about what it is and how it is going to help you, but I'm also going to give you a peek into the Java code that will make it happen. Hope you will learn something new today which will make programming a little bit easier for you. That we are going to look at are, as you can see on the screen, the context which we will relate to as we look at MVC. Also, after that, we will look at the problems that we are facing in our day-to-day activities as programmers, how MVC would be a perfect solution to address our problems, a good look at the architecture itself, the three main components of the architecture, that is the model, view and the controller. We will then look at the implementation MVC solution in Java. To summarize, you will have a look at the advantages you will gain if you implement your application using the MVC architecture. When we speak about the context, it's basically the idea behind context is that as programmers, our work is to provide interactive applications to the end user. Our primary objective is to provide flexibility with respect to the interface between the end user and the computer. The problem that we face, well, there are numerous problems that we faced. The first and foremost being that we might need to represent the same information in different formats, example bar chart, pie chart, with minimum effort. Secondly, if we port the user interface, then the transition has to be very smooth. Basically, the way that the flow goes is that the browser or any other view, a non-browser based view, would be interacting with the controller. The controller would be interacting with the model to get the data, and once the model returns the data, the controller returns it to the respective views, which could be the browser or a general GUI view. So initially the browser will send an HTTP request to the controller, or the view will send regular GUI content or basically an event to the controller. The controller takes the execution parameters that it receives and sends it to the model. The model is the one that actually interacts with your database, executes the queries, gets queries results in data arrays. The data arrays are again passed back to the controller. These data arrays are returned as HTTP response to the browser or as a general data array to a general GUI view. So basically it is the controller who is sitting in between the view and the model and passing information back and forth. Now actually we would also go ahead and see how this is implemented and how this is going to help us. But before that, we would look at a little bit of a detail of each of the components of the MVC architecture. The first component, that is the model. This is one that contains the data. It has all the variables which are related to the database. It provides methods to access and update the data. Examples of the model could be a database, it could be a spreadsheet, or it could be a general file which you would access using file IO. Going on to the next component of the MVC architecture, it is the view. The view is what the end user is finally going to see. It basically gives a visual representation of the model. Like I said, the model is the data and the view is the visual representation of the data. Now we could have multiple views for the same data, that is the model. So the same data which is there over here would be represented as a pie chart, could be represented as a bar chart, or could be represented as a line chart. And whenever the model is updated, the views are informed and they are allowed to change themselves. The third and the most important component is the controller, which is generally a servlet when we speak in terms of Java. The users, or basically the view, it interacts with the controller. On the view, there are mouse events, there are keystrokes, there are new windows that are opened. All these events have to be interpreted by the controller. It communicates those activities to the model, and while communicating passes the execution parameters. The data which is retrieved from the model is then returned back to the view. Now we go ahead and have a look at the actual code so that you can see it happening in real time. What we are looking at is a general to-do list. It's a basic to-do list which has certain items. You can add a new item. You can select that item and you can delete it. Of course, there is a lot more that can be done, but the basic implementation of the MVC architecture. Now, the way that the control flows is when you access the first page, it looks for an index.html. So basically, when you run the application from here, this is what you get. This points to index.html. In the web content, there is no index.html per se. But if you see in the web.xml, the index.html it points to a to-do servlet. This to-do servlet is nothing but this Java file called to-do servlet.java. Before we go into looking at the actual to-do servlet, we also see that in the web.xml, the to-do servlet is defined as a listener class, which means that this is the first servlet executed depending on an event which occurs in the application. The event we just did was to access the home page, and this to-do servlet class is going to listen for that event, and it is going to do certain things like initialization, and then it will call the doGet method. But before we even go to that, we see that initially there are parameters which are set up in the initialization parameters for the JDBC driver and the connection string, so that we don't have to do it every time. We do it just at the initialization. Context initialize, as you would know, is the first method that is called when the servlet is executed, when it is just loaded up. We get a handle to the servlet context, and what we are going to do is we are going to create a new to-do list. The to-do servlet.java, as you see, is the of accessing index.html was sent to to-do servlet, and this to-do servlet is going to instantiate a to-do list, which is nothing but our model for the program. To initialize the model, we have to pass the JDBC driver and the connection string. The to-do list which is defined over here, the constructor, as it takes the JDBC driver, connection strings, and just establishes a connection to the database. So the to-do list. Now when the doGet method is called, we get a handle to the servlet context again, and we get the attribute to-do list which was set over here in the initialization. So now our to-do list is a valid model that is pointing to the database. This to-do list has a method called getToDoItems. As you see, the getToDoItems calls a method called refreshList. All that refresh list is going to do is going to establish a connection, and it is going to return us an array list. So this is where the array list is returned. We set it in the attribute of the request, and this request we pass on to todo.jsp, which you now see is our model. So again, if we go to todo.jsp, all it does is it will request the to-do items, it iterates over it, and it displays everything in a select object. That is the to-do ID, which is set as the value, and the to-do item, which is set as the actual item which is displayed in the drop-down. This select object is enclosed by a form which has a submit button which is delete selected item. So as soon as I click delete selected item, it calls delete item.todo. Going back to the web.xml again, if you see delete item.do points to a delete to-do servlet, which is nothing but another Java file called delete to-do servlet.java. The parameter which is passed, the delete ID, is taken from the drop-down. Again, we get a handle to the to-do list, and we call the method delete item on the to-do list. Delete item again gets a connection, again executes a simple delete query on the database, which is what does our job of actually selecting that particular item and deleting it from the database, as we saw over here. When we selected this and we clicked delete, it got deleted from the database because of this process. Similarly, there is an add new item in the todo.jsp. This calls add item.do. Now add item.do, again going back to the web.xml, if you see it points to an add to do servlet. The add to do servlet is just again going to get a handle to the to do list, and it's going to call the method add item. And as you could guess, add item does nothing but calls an insert statement, which inserts that to do into the database. So summarizing, the to do list, the to do servlet.java is your controller. The main index.html, which was the todo.jsp, actually is going to redirect the control to the to-do servlet. It's going to pass the parameters to the to-do servlet. At every point, the to-do servlet is going to instantiate the to-do list.java, which is nothing but the actual model which is going to execute the queries, return us the results, and the to-do servlet will again pass it to todo.jsp. So this was a basic implementation of the model view controller architecture. To summarize, the advantages that you saw were that the data, that is the to-do list.java, was separated from the view, that is the todo.jsp. So if you have to make any changes to todo.jsp, you don't have to bother about the queries that are there in the program. Whereas if you have everything in one JSP file, the designer might actually end up tampering with the query code rather than working on the design part of it. It separates the application behavior, the controller, from the view. So you see all the requests were directed to the controller. It is the controller's job to get the data from the model and send it to the view. Our main problem where we wanted multiple views for the same data, like in multi-view applications, where in one page you might just want to see an overview and in another page you might want to see the detail. The data is going to be the same. It is just that in the overview you might pick up 2 or 3 columns, and in the detail you will pick up all the columns. But it is much more simplified by the query being executed by the model and the view deciding what it wants to show and what it doesn't want to show. The different UI platforms like mobile and desktop, again the data is the same, it is just the view which is different. So things are well demarcated from each other. If you have an alternate design to your application, you might want to have a blue color design for one, you might like to have a green color design for another client. It is just a matter of changing a style sheet. None of the other code gets altered. Well, thank you so much, and we hope that you have learned a lot in this small tutorial of the model view controller architecture. Thank you.